The air in the James S. Brady press briefing room was a familiar concoction of stale coffee, industrial carpet cleaner, and low-grade, simmering anxiety. It was a space built for confrontation, yet defined by a rigid, almost theatrical protocol. The 49 seats, upholstered in a durable, forgettable blue, were arranged in 7 neat rows, each one a testament to a journalistic hierarchy as clear and unyielding as a military chain of command. The front row belonged to the legacy, networks and wire services, the big guns. Their occupants possessing a proprietary stillness, a calm that came from knowing the first question was their birthright. Further back, the digital upstarts and foreign press fidgeted, their energy a mix of ambition and exclusion. On the brilliant blue backdrop behind the podium, the words "The White House in Washington" were stitched in pristine white, framing the iconic presidential seal. The seal itself, a golden eagle clutching an olive branch and 13 arrows, seemed to watch over the room with a permanent, gilded indifference. The cameras, mounted on tripods in the aisles and on a riser in the back, were the room's true natives. Their lenses, dark and unblinking, were the conduits through which this hermetically sealed drama would be broadcast to millions. Their collective hum, a constant electronic undertone. The day was overcast, a flat gray Washington light filtering weakly through the windows, doing little to dispel the artificial glare of the television lights. The lights were always on, always hot, creating a perpetual state of high noon inside the briefing room, regardless of the season or the time of day. They baked the occupants, forcing a sheen of sweat on foreheads, a subtle physical manifestation of the pressure that permeated the atmosphere. The press corps had been waiting for 27 minutes past the scheduled start time, a delay that was neither unusual nor unexpected. It was a small, routine assertion of power, a reminder of who controlled the clock. They filled the time with the rituals of their trade. Keyboards clacked in sporadic bursts as reporters filed pre-written shells of their stories, leaving blank spaces for the inevitable quotes. Phones were scrawled with practiced flicks of the thumb, eyes scanning for breaking news that might render their planned questions obsolete. Whispers were exchanged, low and clipped, analyses of the morning's cable news segments, gossip about a potential staff shakeup, bets on the president's mood. It was a community bound by a shared adversary and a deep, often unacknowledged codependence. They were here to hold him to account, but they needed him for their ratings, their clicks, their very relevance. The side door to the left of the podium opened without a sound. A familiar and jarring breach of the room's stagnant air, he entered. Not with a stride, but with a presence, a physical occupation of space that seemed to bend the room's energy toward him. The low hum of chatter ceased instantly, replaced by the staccato explosion of 100 camera shutters. The sound was like dry leaves crackling underfoot, a frantic mechanical applause. He moved to the podium with a deliberate, rolling gait, his shoulders set, his head held high. His suit was dark navy, the knot of his red silk tie, a thick, powerful wedge beneath his chin. In his left hand he carried a sheaf of papers folded once. He placed them on the lectern, his movements economical, almost dismissive. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply stood, his hands gripping the sides of the podium, his gaze sweeping across the front row. It was not a glance. It was a survey, an act of appraisal. He looked from face to face, his expression a carefully calibrated mask of confidence and disdain. The reporters in his line of sight met his gaze, their own faces impassive, professional, yet behind their eyes, the mental machinery was worry, calculating, preparing. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken history years of televised battles, of accusations and denials, of a relationship that had devolved from adversarial to openly hostile. He began with prepared remarks, his voice a familiar baritone amplified. To fill every corner of the room, he spoke of economic indicators, of job numbers that defied economists' predictions, of a stock market that continued its relentless climb. His delivery was punctuated by short, sharp gestures of his right hand, a pointed finger here, a flat-palmed chop there. He read from his papers, but often looked up, his eyes finding the red lights of the live cameras at the back of the room, speaking not to the 49 people in front of him, but to the vast, unseen audience beyond. The reporters scribbled dutifully. In their notebooks, their pens scratching, their faces illuminated by the glow of their laptops. This was the overture, the predictable opening movement. The real performance had yet to begin. After concluding his summary of administrative achievements, he squared his shoulders, a subtle shift in posture that signaled the transition. He was now ready for questions. A hand in the front row went up, belonging to the chief White House correspondent for a major television network. He pointed at her. Her question was sharp, concise, concerning the administration's latest foreign policy maneuver in the Middle East. He answered it with a broad, sweeping statement about his deal-making prowess, deflecting the specificity of her query and reframing it as another example of his singular success in an arena where his predecessors had failed. He did not mention the nuances of the regional alliances or the potential for destabilization that her question had implied. He simply declared victory. The second question came from a wire service reporter, a man known for his meticulous, fact-based inquiries. It concerned a new set of environmental regulations. The president's response was a tirade against the job-killing policies of the past, a narrative of liberation from bureaucratic strangulation. Again, the details were subsumed by the message. The room settled into its familiar rhythm. A reporter's precise question met with a president's broad populist rebuttal. It was a dance, and both sides knew the steps. The tension, however, did not dissipate. It coiled, waiting for the right trigger. The trigger came from the third row. A correspondent from a news organization, the president had frequently labeled an enemy of the people, was granted a rare opportunity. She stood, her voice steady, and began her question. It started with a preamble, citing recent polling. Data from her own organization, conducted in partnership with a university polling center. The polls showed his approval ratings slipping in key battleground states, particularly among suburban women. They showed a growing enthusiasm gap, with his opponent's supporters expressing more certainty about their intention to vote. As she recited the numbers, a 9-point deficit in Pennsylvania, a 7-point deficit in Michigan, a change came over the man at the podium. It was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. His grip on the lectern tightened, his knuckles whitening. The easy, almost jovial demeanor he had affected during his previous answers evaporated, replaced by a cold, focused intensity. His eyes, which had been scanning the room, now locked onto her, and a faint, dismissive smile played on his lips. He let her finish. The room was silent as her voice trailed off, the polling numbers hanging in the air like an indictment. He did not answer her question about how he intended to address this polling deficit. He did not engage with the substance of her inquiry at all. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows on the lectern, creating an illusion of intimacy that was deeply menacing. He began to speak, his voice lower now, more conversational, yet carrying a harder edge. He did not address the reporter directly at first. He spoke as if she were a specimen under glass, a case study in a malady he was about to diagnose for the world. He spoke of the 2016 election, a touchstone, a foundational myth. He recounted the near-unanimous predictions of his defeat, the certainty of the pollsters and the pundits. He painted a vivid picture of election night, of the shock and dismay on the faces of news anchors as the results defied their models. It was a story he had told 1,000 times, in rallies, in interviews, on social media. But here, in this room, aimed at the very people he held responsible, it took on the quality of a verdict being read. Then he pivoted. He picked up his folded papers. He unfolded them slowly, deliberately. They were printouts. He held one up. It was, he announced, the cross-stabs from the very poll the reporter had just cited. He claimed to have studied them that morning. His tone shifted from narrative to prosecutorial. He began to dissect the poll's methodology, not as a statistician would, but as a brawler looking for a weakness. He pointed to the partisan weighting. He read the numbers aloud. They polled far more Democrats than Republicans, he declared, his voice rising in indignation. He did not provide the context that pollsters often weight their samples to reflect the expected partisan turnout of an election, a standard, if debatable, practice. He presented it as a simple, self-evident act of fraud. It's a fake poll. He stated, the words landing like stones in the quiet room. He looked directly at the reporter who had asked the question. Her face, projected onto the large screens flanking the stage for the benefit of the television audience, was a study in professional composure, but a slight flush was visible on her neck. Her mouth was set in a firm line. She could not respond. The rules of the forum forbade it. She had to stand and absorb the attack. She was, in that moment, speechless by protocol. He was not finished. He moved on to another poll, this one from a different news network, one he also held in contempt. He had a printout for that one too. He held it up a prop in his one-man show. He went through the same routine, attacking the sample size, the D2R ratio, the source of the poll. He called the pollster by name, a man with decades of experience in the field, and dismissed him as a hack. He used the term suppression polls, a phrase his campaign had been carefully cultivating for months. He explained the concept. To the audience beyond the room, these polls, he alleged, were not designed to measure public opinion, but to shape it. They were a political weapon, designed to dispirit his supporters, to convince them that their cause was lost, that there was no point in even showing up to vote. He was framing the act of polling not as a flawed science, but as a deliberate conspiracy. He was transforming a debate over statistical methodology to a battle for the soul of the country. The reporters in the room were a tableau of varied reactions. In the front row, the veterans scribbled furiously, their faces impassive masks. They had seen versions of this before. Their job was to document, not to react. Further back, some reporters exchanged quick, wide-eyed glances. A few shook their heads almost imperceptibly. The reporter who had asked the initial question remained standing, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the president. She had become the focal point of the drama, a silent protagonist in a scene she had unwittingly initiated. The only sounds in the room were the president's amplified voice and the ceaseless, predatory clicking of the camera shutters. The atmosphere was no longer that of a press conference. It had become a public trial, and he was the prosecutor, judge, and star. Witness, all at once. The press corps was the defendant, and they were being tried in the court of public opinion. He widened his attack, moving from the specific polls to the media writ large. He pointed his finger, sweeping it across the assembled journalists, accused them of being complicit in the fraud of knowingly publishing fake numbers to damage him politically, called them corrupt, dishonest, enemies of the people. Each accusation was delivered with a searing certainty that brooked no argument. He was not just questioning their work, he was questioning their patriotism, their integrity, their very reason for being. The journalists were trapped. To argue back would be to violate their professional codes and create a spectacle that would only serve his narrative of a biased, activist press. To remain silent was to allow his accusations to stand unchallenged in the moment, broadcast live to millions. They chose silence, a disciplined, professional silence that felt, in the charged atmosphere of the room, like a kind of surrender. They were unable to justify their data not because it was unjustifiable in a reasoned academic debate, but because this was not a debate. It was a mauling. Outside the hermetically sealed bubble of the White House, the digital world was igniting. Even before the press conference ended, clips of the confrontation were being sliced, packaged, and disseminated across social media. On Twitter, the video of him holding up the polling data and declaring it fake went viral within minutes. Pro-precedent accounts shared it with triumphant captions. Finally, Trump exposes the fake news media's crooked polls. And watch reporters get called out? They have no answers. The hashtags #FakePolls and #enemy of the people began to trend. On Facebook, the same clips were shared hundreds of thousands of times. The comment sections a roaring echo chamber of approval. His users praised his fearlessness, his willingness to fight back against a hostile establishment. They saw not a president attacking a free press, but a champion of the people tearing down a corrupt institution. The clips were short, decontextualized, and powerful. They did not include the reporter's calm, data-driven question, only his thunderous, accusatory response. They were perfectly engineered for an information ecosystem that rewards emotion. In conflict over nuance and fact, simultaneously a different reaction was unfolding in other corners of the digital sphere. Journalists, academics, and anti-president accounts shared the same clips, but with captions of horror and alarm. They described the scene as a chilling assault on democratic norms, a page from an autocrat's playbook. They pointed out the factual inaccuracies in his critique of the polling methodologies. They defended the journalists in the room, praising their professionalism under fire. Polling experts took to Twitter to write long, detailed threads explaining sampling, weighting, and margins of error, but their nuanced explanations were algorithmically disadvantaged against the raw emotional power of the president's attack. The nation was watching the same event, but seeing two entirely different realities. The social media platforms, with their filter bubbles and engagement-driven designs, ensured that these two realities would rarely intersect. Users were served the version of the story that confirmed their existing beliefs, deepening the chasm that divided the country. Back in the briefing room, the president seemed to sense that he had reached his crescendo. He had dominated the news cycle. He had created the moment he wanted. He took one last, sweeping look at the silent press corps, a look of triumph. He then gestured to his press secretary, who was standing by the wall, and in a jarring shift of tone announced a new initiative to support small businesses. It was as if the previous 20 minutes of open warfare had never happened. He took one more softball question from a friendly outlet in the back of the room, answered it briefly, and then said, "Thank you very much." He turned, not waiting for the customary thank you from the press, and walked out the same side door he had entered. The moment the door clicked shut, the spell was broken. A collective exhale seemed to pass through the room. The silence was replaced by a cacophony of voices as reporters began speaking to each other all at once. Laptops were snapped shut. Reporters grabbed their gear, heading for the exits to file their stories or to book a spot on the White House lawn for a live television stand-up. The reporter who had been the target of the initial attack was immediately surrounded by her colleagues, a protective scrum forming around her as she made her way out. Her face was still composed, but her eyes held a look of weary resolve. The air, which had been thick with tension, was now buzzing with frantic post-battle energy. The story was no longer about the president's foreign policy or environmental regulations. The story was the battle itself. That evening, the event was replayed and dissected endlessly on cable news. The split screen was the visual metaphor. For the nation, on one network, a panel of commentators described the president's performance as masterful, a brilliant way to control the narrative and energize his base. They showed Man-in-Nest Street interviews with his supporters, who echoed his sentiments about the biased media and the fake polls. The host praised him for his fighting spirit. On another network, a different panel used words like authoritarian, dangerous, and unhinged. They brought on polling experts to debunk his claims and constitutional scholars to warn of the long-term damage to democratic institutions. They interviewed former White House correspondents from previous administrations, both Republican and Democratic, who spoke of a bygone era of respect for the institution of the press, however adversarial the relationship. Both networks showed clips from the press conference. They selected different moments, framed them with different chirons, interpreted them through entirely different ideological lenses. They were not just reporting the news, they were constructing competing narratives for their respective audiences. The days that followed saw the polling debate intensify. The president's campaign amplified the suppression polls narrative, running digital ads and sending out fundraising, emails based on the press conference confrontation. The media outlets whose polls had been attacked published lengthy articles defending their methodologies, explaining their processes in painstaking detail. They interviewed independent polling experts who largely validated their work. Then, while acknowledging the inherent uncertainties of polling, But these detailed defenses were buried on page A14 of the newspaper or lost in the endless scroll of a website. The president's attack, simple, powerful, and endlessly repeatable, had already cemented itself in the minds of his followers. He had successfully inoculated them against any negative polling data that would be released in the run-up to the election. He had supplied them with the argument it was all fake. This strategy was not born in a vacuum. The narrative traced its roots back to his first campaign, to his early rallies where he would point to the press pen and encourage the crowd to boo. It was a strategy built on a pre-existing decline in public trust in institutions of all kinds, a decline that had been decades in the making. He did not create the fire. He masterfully poured gasoline on it. His team understood the modern media landscape better than their opponents. They understood that, in an attention economy, conflict is currency. They understood that for a significant portion of the electorate, the traditional gatekeepers of information, the legacy newspapers, the broadcast networks, were no longer seen as neutral arbiters of fact, but as partisan actors with their own agenda. The press conference was not just an emotional outburst. It was a calculated and strategically sound maneuver in a new kind of political warfare. One fought not on the battleground of policy, but on the battleground of reality itself. Weeks turned into months. The election came. The night of the election, the nation held its breath. Early results once again seemed to defy the polls. In several key states, the president's performance was significantly stronger than most mainstream polls had predicted. The race was far closer than the final polling averages had suggested. On social media, his supporters erupted in vindication. The press conference months earlier was cited again and again. He had been right all along. The polls had been fake. The media had been lying. For several hours on election night, it appeared as though 2016 was happening all over again. A stunning rebuke of the polling industry and the media that relied on it. But then the narrative shifted. As the mail-in ballots, which were disproportionately cast by his opponent's supporters due to the ongoing pandemic and the president's own rhetoric against mail-in voting, were slowly counted, the tide began to turn. The red mirage of election night began to fade, replaced by a steady, inexorable blue shift. One by one, the battleground states that had looked so close were called for his opponent. The final result, when it came days later, was a decisive loss for the incumbent president. The polls in the end had not been wrong about the winner. They had correctly predicted the victor. They had, however, been wrong about the margin, had understated the president's support, just as they had in 2016. The industry was left to grapple with a profound crisis of confidence. They had gotten the outcome right, but their errors in margin had fueled a narrative of fraud and deceit that now threatened the peaceful transfer of power. The story, however, did not end there. The president, citing the discrepancy between the final vote and the pre-election polls, refused to concede. The confrontation in the briefing room months earlier was no longer just a media critique. It became a central pillar of a new, far more dangerous claim. The fake polls narrative seamlessly morphed into a fake election narrative. The same logic was applied. If the media and the pollsters would lie and conspire to release fraudulent numbers to suppress the vote, then it stood to reason that election officials would do the same to rig the final count. His supporters, conditioned for months and years to distrust any information that came from outside his inner circle, readily accepted this new reality. The seeds of doubt, so carefully planted in that heated press conference, had now blossomed into a full-blown assault on the foundations of the democratic process. The unresolved ethical dilemma lingered long after the dust had settled. The press conference was a moment of pure political theater, but it exposed a genuine weakness. The polling industry did have a problem. Their models had repeatedly failed to accurately capture the full extent of the president's support. Their inability to correct the errors of 2016 gave his accusations a kernel of truth that he expertly weaponized. Was his attack, then, a cynical ploy by a demagogue to destroy public trust for his own political gain? Or was it a crude, bombastic, but ultimately necessary public accountability session for a powerful industry that had grown complacent and out of touch with a large segment of the American population? The question was impossible to answer definitively, because it was, in some measure, both. He had identified a real problem, but he had done so not to fix it, not to encourage better polling or more nuanced journalism, but to exploit it, to tear down the entire edifice of shared fact, so that only his word would remain. The journalists in that room, standing silent as he assailed them, were not just defending their work or their employers. Beneath them was the abyss of a post-truth world, and the man at the podium was holding the lever, smiling as he tested its strength. The true fall from grace was not his, for he never claimed to adhere to the old rules. It was the fall of an idea, the idea that a shared, verifiable reality was a prerequisite for a self-governing people. The briefing room was empty now, the lights turned off. But the echoes of that confrontation and the questions it raised continued to reverberate through a nation that could no longer agree on what it had just seen. The quiet hum of the empty briefing room gave way to a new kind of cacophony, one that played out not in a single physical space, but across the fractured landscape of the nation itself. The president's campaign, having lost the election in the certified vote counts, is now embarked on a legal and public relations war of unprecedented scale and ferocity. The battle was no longer over polling data, but over the very ballots that constituted the Democratic Act. The morphing of the fake polls narrative into the stolen election narrative was seamless, a chillingly logical progression for a base condition to believe in a permanent conspiratorial state of siege. The theater of confrontation moved from the White House briefing room to the nation's courtrooms. But the star of the show remained the same. Even as he dispatched a new cast of characters to argue his case, a legal team was assembled, branded by its leader as an elite strike force. The title suggested precision, expertise, and formidable power. The reality, as it began to unfold, was something far more surreal. A traveling roadshow of frantic improvisation and theatrical outrage. The first major public spectacle of this new phase did not take place at the Supreme Court or even a federal courthouse, but in the gritty, industrial backlot of a Philadelphia landscaping company. On a Saturday morning, as the major news networks finally projected the election for his opponent, the president's personal attorney stood before a hastily arranged podium in the parking lot of Four Seasons Total Landscaping, situated between a crematorium and an adult bookstore. The backdrop was not a row of American flags, but a garage door plastered with campaign signs. The assembled press corps, bewildered by the location, stood on the uneven asphalt, their microphones picking up the distant rumble of traffic from the nearby interstate. The scene was a perfect, almost too perfect, metaphor for the legal effort itself, a grand declaration of constitutional importance, staged in a setting of profound and baffling absurdity. Here, against the smell of fertilizer and damp earth, the attorney spun tales of poll watchers blocked from observing the vote count in Philadelphia, alleging a conspiracy so vast it had stolen the state. The claims were delivered with righteous anger, but the surroundings undercut the gravity, creating a sense of a narrative detached from any recognizable reality. The world watched, not with the bated breath of a constitutional crisis, but with the stunned disbelief of witnessing a dado-deist performance piece. This was merely the opening act. In the days that followed, a blizzard of lawsuits, more than 60 in total, was filed in state and federal courts across the key battleground states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, Wisconsin. The legal documents themselves were often a chaotic collage of accusations, statistical improbabilities, and sworn affidavits from individuals who claimed to have witnessed irregularities. The allegations ranged from the plausibly unproven to the patently bizarre. They spoke of mysterious late-night ballot drops, of voting machines programmed to switch votes from one candidate to another, of ballots cast in the names of the dead. Each lawsuit was a fishing expedition, a public performance designed to cast doubt and create headlines. With the actual legal merits often appearing as a secondary concern, the filings were frequently riddled with typographical errors, procedural mistakes, and a fundamental misunderstanding of election law. They demanded extraordinary remedies, that millions of legally cast votes be disenfranchised, that state legislatures be empowered to override the will of the people and appoint their own slates of electors. The response from the judiciary was a slow, methodical, and relentless demolition of these claims. Judge after judge, from state trial courts to the federal appellate circuits, examined the evidence presented and found it wanting. The president had appointed over 200 conservative judges to the federal bench, a fact he had often touted as one of his greatest achievements. It was these very judges in many cases who now ruled against him. In Pennsylvania, a federal judge, a prominent Republican and member of the Federalist Society, dismissed a lawsuit seeking to block certification of the state's results with a scathing opinion. He wrote that the campaign's case was a Frankenstein's monster, cobbled together from speculative accusations and strained legal arguments, presented in court without any concrete evidence of the massive fraud it alleged. He noted that the campaign was not asking the court to enfranchise a single voter. It was asking for the disenfranchisement of nearly 7 million. His ruling was not an expression of political opinion, but a defense of legal principle and evidentiary standards. Similar scenes played out across the country. In Michigan, a judge found the campaign's claims of fraud to be incorrect and not credible. In Arizona, a lawyer for the campaign was forced to concede under questioning from a judge that they were not alleging fraud, only observing irregularities, a concession that gutted the entire premise of their public-facing narrative. In case after case, the legal team's fiery press conference rhetoric withered under the cold, dispassionate scrutiny of a courtroom, where they offered conspiracy. The judges asked for facts, where they presented affidavits based on hearsay. In suspicion, the judges demanded credible, specific evidence, and time and again, they failed to provide it. The elite strike force was losing, not on technicalities or because of biased judges, but because they did not have a case. Their legal war was a campaign of smoke and mirrors, and the judiciary, for the most part, refused to be deceived. Yet, while the legal effort was collapsing in the courts of law, it was thriving in the court of public opinion, or at least in the segment of it that the president commanded. A parallel reality was being constructed. Broadcast 24/7 on friendly cable networks and amplified by a vast digital ecosystem of websites, podcasts, and social media influencers. In this reality, the court losses were not evidence of a weak case, but further proof of the conspiracy. The judges, even his own appointees, were now part of the deep state. The media's reporting on the losses was dismissed as fake news. The campaign had created a closed-loop information system where the only trusted sources were those who affirmed the narrative of a stolen election. This parallel reality had its own high priests and priestesses. The president's personal attorney was joined by a new figure, a former federal prosecutor who brought a new level of conspiratorial fervor to the effort. She spoke of a global plot involving communist money from Venezuela, Cuba, and China, which had financed the creation of the voting machine software to rig the election. She claimed to have evidence so powerful it would be like releasing the Kraken, a mythical sea monster. This narrative was unveiled during a now infamous press conference held at the headquarters of the Republican National Committee. The scene was even more surreal than the landscaping company. Under the hot glare of the television lights, for 90 minutes, the legal team laid out their grand, unified theory of the steal. As the president's attorney spoke, sweat beading on his face, a dark liquid, apparently hair dye, began to run in 2 distinct streaks down his cheeks. The image became an instant, indelible symbol of the entire enterprise, a desperate melting facade. The other attorney, meanwhile, spoke with a chilling certainty, her eyes wide, as she detailed the supposed international plot, connecting dots that existed only in the ether of online forums and fringe websites. She offered no verifiable evidence, only the promise that it was forthcoming. The Kraken was never released. The lawsuits filed under its banner in Georgia and Michigan were dismissed by judges as a mishmash of theories, conjecture, and speculation. The affidavits were found to be filled with nonsense. One expert witness, described in a filing as a military intelligence expert, was later revealed to be a Dallas area IT consultant who drew his conclusions from scouring online conspiracy forums. The legal filings were so devoid of merit that judges began to openly discuss the possibility of sanctions against the lawyers who had filed them, a rare and serious step for conduct that abuses the judicial process. The legal team itself began to fracture. The president's campaign issued a statement distancing themselves from the Kraken attorney, declaring that she was not part of their official team, even though she had stood beside them at the RNC press conference just days earlier. The elite strike force was in disarray, its members attacking each other. Its credibility shattered in the eyes of anyone outside the bubble of belief, with the courts providing no path to victory. The strategy shifted again. The focus turned from legal challenges to a direct political pressure campaign. The targets were the Republican officials in key states who were responsible for certifying the election results: governors, secretaries of state, and state legislators. The president himself led this effort. He summoned the Republican leaders of the Michigan legislature to the White House, a highly unusual meeting that was widely seen as an attempt to persuade them to ignore their state's popular vote and instead appoint a slate of electors loyal to him. The legislators, after the meeting, issued a statement affirming that they would follow the law and honor the outcome of the vote. The pressure had failed. The most intense and well-documented pressure campaign was focused on Georgia. The state's Republican Secretary of State became the primary target of the president's fury. Having overseen 3 separate counts of the ballots, the initial machine count, a full hand recount, and a final machine recount requested by the campaign, he had repeatedly and publicly affirmed the accuracy of the result. For this, he and his family were subjected to a torrent of abuse and death threats from the president's supporters. The campaign was not just political, it was personal and menacing. The crescendo of this pressure campaign came in the form of a 1-hour phone call on the second day of the new year. A recording of the call would later be released to the public, providing an unvarnished and stunning window into the president's state of mind. On the call, the president, joined by his chief of staff, berated the Georgia Secretary of State and his office's general counsel. His voice was a rambling, insistent torrent of disproven conspiracy theories and false claims. He alleged that thousands of dead people had voted. He claimed a poll worker had been caught on video scanning the same ballots multiple times. He spoke of shredded ballots and rigged machines. Each claim had already been investigated and debunked by the Secretary of State's office. In fact, the secretary and his lawyer patiently and repeatedly explained. The president was unmoved by their facts. He dismissed their explanations, telling them they were wrong, that they had a faulty understanding of their own state's election. The conversation was a microcosm of the entire post-election period, a collision between the empirical, evidence-based world of the election officials and the conspiratorial, faith-based world of the president. The call reached its climax when the president made his purpose plain. He did not want another investigation or a debate over the facts. He wanted a result, he told the Secretary of State, in a tone that was both pleading and threatening that. He just wanted to find 11,780 votes, which was one more than his margin of defeat. It was a direct request to alter the certified, audited outcome of a presidential election. The Secretary of State refused, his voice calm and firm, stating that the data they had was correct. The line had been drawn, even the president's own. Attorney General, one of his most loyal and effective cabinet members, could not support the narrative. In an interview with the Associated Press on the 1st of December, the Attorney General stated that the Department of Justice had investigated the allegations of widespread fraud and had not found evidence of it on a scale that could have changed the outcome of the election. This was a devastating public break. It was a declaration from the nation's top law enforcement officer that the president's central claim was untrue. The president was reportedly enraged by the statement. The Attorney General, seeing his position as untenable, would resign just before Christmas. His departure removed one of the last remaining institutional guardrails. The final, desperate legal maneuver was a lawsuit filed directly with the U.S. Supreme Court by the Attorney General of Texas. The suit sought to invalidate the election results in 4 other states: Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, arguing that their pandemic-related changes to election procedures were unconstitutional. It was a long shot, legally dubious effort. But it was quickly joined by 17 other Republican state attorneys general and more than 100 Republican members of Congress. It was the last great hope for the president's supporters. That the courts would intervene. Supreme Court, with its 6-3 conservative majority, including 3 justices appointed by the president himself, acted swiftly. In a brief, unsigned order, the court refused to even hear the case, stating that Texas lacked the legal standing to challenge how other states conduct their elections. The door to the courts was now slammed shut and bolted, with every legal and political avenue for overturning the election exhausted. The focus of the president and his most ardent followers narrowed to a single date, January 6th. This was the day Congress would meet in a joint session to perform the constitutionally mandated and normally ceremonial task of counting the certified electoral votes from each state and formally affirming the winner of the election. For over a century, this process had been a formality, a peaceful coda to a hard-fought campaign. But it was now being reimagined as the final battlefield, the last chance to stop the steal. The president began to relentlessly promote a rally to be held in Washington, D.C. on that day. "Be there will be wild," he tweeted. The call went out to his supporters across the country. Come to Washington, protest the certification. Make your voices heard. The vice president, who in his role as president of the Senate would preside over the session, became the new singular focus of the pressure campaign. The president and his allies began to publicly and privately insist that the vice president had the unilateral power to reject the certified electoral votes from the contested states, an interpretation of the Constitution that was rejected by virtually every legal scholar across the political spectrum. The vice president was being asked to choose between his loyalty to the president and his oath to the Constitution. The stage was now set for a confrontation unlike any other in American history. The legal challenges had failed. The pressure on state officials had failed. The judiciary, from local courts to the Supreme Court, had held the line. The established institutions of American democracy had, under immense strain, performed their functions. But the narrative of the stolen election had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just a legal or political claim. It had become an article of faith for millions, a sacred truth. They had been told for weeks that their country was being stolen from them, that their votes had been nullified by a vast, shadowy conspiracy. They had been told that January 6th was their last stand. And so, from every corner of the country, they began to come. They came by car, by bus, by plane, drawn to the Capitol by a promise of a wild and historic day. They were coming, not to witness a ceremony, but to fight in a war they had been told was already underway. The ethical dilemma of the post-truth world, born in a briefing room confrontation over polls, was about to manifest itself in a physical assault on the very citadel of the Republic. The unresolved questions about fact and fiction were no longer academic. They were about to be answered in broken glass and splintered wood in the halls of the U.S. Capitol itself.